The German soldiers thought they would be put in chains, go hungry, and be treated badly. However, when their crowded ships arrived in the United States, they were met with something very different. After months of intense fighting in North Africa and Europe, the captured men were ready for revenge from their enemy. Many whispered that the Americans would treat them like animals, make them work until they died in mines, or leave them to starve behind fences. But when they finally arrived in America, they were shocked by what they saw. Instead of angry guards yelling orders with guns ready, they saw neat camps with wooden buildings, medical tents, and even flower gardens near the entrances. The trip across the Atlantic Ocean had been hard, with crowded spaces, sickness, and fear of attacks from underwater boats. Rumors spread among the soldiers that they might not make it to America alive. But when the ships finally docked, they were led inland in lines, watched but not hurt. Local people sometimes gathered near the train stations, staring curiously at the enemy soldiers who had once been part of Hitler's army. To the prisoners' surprise, there was no violence or insults from the crowds. Farmers, mothers with children, and workers in overalls watched quietly, some even offering food or cigarettes through the train windows. When they arrived at camps in Texas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, and many other states, the prisoners were registered, given clean clothes with big PW letters on them, and shown where they would live. Each building had rows of beds, heaters for the winter, and windows for light. Compared to the muddy holes in Tunisia or the freezing shelters on the Eastern Front, this was almost luxurious. Some prisoners joked nervously that they had accidentally found a fancy vacation spot. Others were still suspicious, believing that this comfortable appearance was just a mean trick before things got worse. The first night in the camp was uneasy. Many stayed awake, listening to the quiet sound of American guards walking around. There were no yells, no beatings, and no sounds of men crying in pain. The prisoners could hardly believe it. They remembered stories from Nazi propaganda that described Americans as violent criminals who wanted to destroy everything. But the quietness of the camp proved those scary stories wrong. Morning brought another surprise. Before the prisoners even left their buildings, guards and kitchen workers brought hot containers to the dining hall. The air filled with a strong, bitter smell that none of the Germans could mistake. It was coffee, real coffee, hot and dark. After years of drinking fake coffee made from roasted acorns or barley, just the smell was enough to amaze them. Some prisoners hesitated, wondering if they were allowed to have it. Others rushed forward, holding out their cups, barely able to hide their excitement. That first taste was something they would never forget. The hot liquid spread warmth through their bodies, chasing away the lingering cold of the morning. A few men mumbled that they had not had real coffee since before the war. Others laughed quietly, shaking their heads in disbelief. This was not the treatment they expected. This was not the revenge they had feared. Instead, America had welcomed them with a drink that represented both kindness and plenty. The German prisoners soon realized that this was not an accident or a special welcome. It was normal. Every morning, without fail, the dining hall served coffee. The drink became the first small tradition of their new lives as prisoners. In those early days, the surprise of having hot coffee every morning overshadowed their confusion about being defeated soldiers in a foreign land. No matter what else was in store for them, the United States had already changed their worst expectations with something as simple as a hot cup. For most of the captured soldiers, that first morning was not just a one-time thing, but the start of an amazing routine. As the sun came up over the barbed wire fences and the guard towers, the dining halls filled with the clatter of metal trays and the steady sound of coffee machines being opened. The drink was not given unwillingly or in small amounts. It was plentiful, as if the enemy's comfort did not matter much to the American authorities. To men who came from a Germany where ration cards controlled every bit of food and fake powder was used for coffee, the sight of hot cups poured without hesitation was confusing. The routine happened with military precision. Before attendance was taken, prisoners lined up neatly, many still wearing their given denim clothes marked with big white letters. Kitchen workers, sometimes American soldiers, sometimes even other prisoners assigned to the job, used ladles to scoop coffee from heavy steel containers and fill mugs to the top. Along with the coffee, prisoners received bread, porridge, or eggs, depending on what was available. Yet, it was always the drink itself that stood out. For Germans who had spent years wishing for a real taste of caffeine, this simple daily offering seemed both unbelievable and deeply ironic. The enemy was giving them what their own country could not. Soon enough, the camp population began to create an informal culture around this morning routine. Prisoners would share stories in quiet voices while enjoying the bitter warmth. Veterans from the Russian front compared it to the frozen misery of field kitchens where lukewarm barley drink was often the best they could get. Africa Corps survivors remembered desert battles where the heat dried their throats, but offered no relief, and where real coffee was almost impossible to find. For younger soldiers, many barely 20, it was the first time in years they had tasted the drink their parents once enjoyed at family tables, before the war took over everything. Americans understood well how important coffee was for morale. Their own troops overseas had entire systems dedicated to making sure beans and grounds reached the front lines. The U.S. Army considered coffee a necessity, not a luxury, and applied that idea even to the prisoners in their care. According to the Geneva Conventions, prisoners were entitled to enough food. But America went further, using the drink as a sign of civilization and discipline. By giving coffee daily, the guards not only reinforced the routine, but also sent a quiet message. The prisoners would be treated with order, not cruelty. The psychological effect was significant. Some prisoners later admitted that they started to see their captors with a grudging respect. If the Americans were willing to offer such comforts to their enemies, what did that say about the wealth and stability of their nation? Conversations began to spread in the buildings. Men wondered about American farms, factories, and shipping routes that could provide such amounts of beans even during wartime. A few even wondered if this plenty proved that their own country's propaganda, portraying America as weak, was based on lies. The daily coffee became a clock, a certainty in a world where time otherwise blurred. Days of being held captive stretched on forever. But the routine provided a marker that kept them grounded. At sunrise, they would smell the coffee and know another day had started. It became more than just something to eat or drink. It was a symbol of predictability in the uncertainty of war. And for many Germans, that consistency itself was almost as shocking as the drink's flavor. Among the Germans, the cultural shock of real coffee went far beyond just the taste. In their homeland, by the middle of the war, coffee had almost disappeared from civilian life. Imports of beans from Latin America and Africa had stopped because of the Allied blockade. Instead, German families brewed fake coffee, a mixture made from roasted barley, chicory, or even acorns. Bitter and lifeless, it provided no caffeine boost, just the feeling of a hot drink. For many soldiers, this fake mixture was all they had known since the early 1940s. Now, faced with hot cups of real coffee in an American camp, they felt like they had stepped into another world. The difference was not just about food, but deeply symbolic. In Germany, the absence of coffee showed scarcity, sacrifice, and the increasing control of war on civilian life. In America, even prisoners of war received it every day. Around camp tables, men shook their heads in disbelief. Some muttered that only a society with huge resources could afford to waste such a luxury on its enemies. Others laughed at the irony that they, once proud soldiers of the Reich, had to surrender before tasting what their families back home could only dream of. The differences extended into camp behavior. Germans traditionally saw coffee as a social drink, associated with gatherings, bakeries, and Sunday afternoons. In the camps, this habit returned. Groups formed around tin mugs where men exchanged jokes, shared gossip, or played cards. Conversations often turned to memories of Germany before the war. Mothers brewing coffee in porcelain pots, fathers reading newspapers at the kitchen table. The drink stirred up feelings of longing, bridging the gap between their current situation and a lost civilian life. Yet for some, the shock had darker undertones. Letters intercepted by censors revealed that some prisoners hesitated to describe the plenty they experienced, fearing how their families facing food lines and bombings would react. Still, others hinted at the contrast. One former prisoner later recalled writing that, "The Americans give us real coffee every morning while you at home cannot find sugar for months." The remark was partly guilty, partly defiant, but it captured the strange reversal of wartime expectations. American guards noticed these reactions with a mix of amusement and curiosity. To them, coffee was so ordinary, so ingrained in daily life that they barely thought it was worth mentioning. Soldiers overseas received powdered coffee in their kits, and civilians drank it with breakfast. To hear prisoners marvel at something so basic only confirmed the gap between the two societies. Some guards joked that coffee was their secret weapon, more effective than guns or fences. Over time, the drink became an informal cultural exchange. Curious prisoners asked about American habits. Learning that U.S. workers drank it at factory breaks, office workers sipped it from thermoses, and soldiers swore they could not march without it. In turn, the Germans shared tales of their brews, laughing bitterly about burnt acorn mixtures and rye experiments. What started as surprise grew into a kind of mutual understanding. The simple act of drinking coffee revealed the everyday life of a society at war. By the end of their first months in captivity, the Germans had come to see coffee not just as a drink, but as a window into American abundance and cultural identity. For them, each mug was proof that life in the United States followed a normal routine untouched by shortages and siege, a striking contrast to the hardship that defined their homeland. Behind the seemingly effortless supply of hot mugs lay one of the most impressive logistical systems of the war. For the United States, coffee was not a treat, but a necessity, ranked as important as bread and tobacco for morale. Even before America joined the war, the government had made trade agreements with Brazil and Colombia, ensuring steady shipments of beans across the Atlantic. Ships escorted by naval vessels kept the supply lines open, and warehouses on the East Coast stored mountains of sacks ready to be roasted, ground, and distributed. In military terms, coffee was built into the way things were done. The Army planned rations with great care, assigning pounds of beans per soldier per month, then applying the same idea to enemy prisoners. The Geneva Convention guaranteed enough food, but the American idea went further. Captives would receive food similar to that given to soldiers stationed at bases in the U.S. This meant that even behind barbed wire, German soldiers woke up to the same caffeinated start as the men guarding them. The Red Cross also played a role. Although the U.S. already had the means to feed its prisoners, international observers inspected camps and noted the regular provision of coffee as a sign of humane treatment. Reports filed in Geneva compared American practices with those of other nations where prisoners often lived on watery soup or stale bread. These observations strengthened America's reputation, showing that it could maintain standards even when dealing with enemies. The cultural importance of coffee in America made its absence unthinkable. During wartime, advertisements urged civilians to support the troops by limiting waste and buying beans in controlled amounts. Posters declared, "Coffee wins wars," connecting the drink to alertness in factories and stamina on battlefields. Soldiers in Europe wrote home asking for care packages with extra cans of ground coffee. That passion reached the camps where providing it to prisoners became almost automatic, part of the same national habit. The sheer scale of the supply impressed the prisoners themselves. In large camps like Camp Swift in Texas or Camp Atterbury in Indiana, thousands of men were served at the same time. Huge containers capable of holding dozens of gallons lined the dining halls. The logistics required steady rail deliveries of beans, from coastal ports to the American heartland where roasting plants worked day and night. For the Germans, who had seen their homeland struggle to deliver even bread in bombed cities, the abundance seemed impossible. Sometimes shortages elsewhere in the U.S. Army showed just how important coffee was. At times, when sugar or meat supplies were low, the flow of beans continued almost without interruption. This surprised German prisoners who expected at least occasional disruptions. Instead, they had to admit that America's global reach, its merchant ships, its access to South American markets, and its industrial power kept the drink flowing without fail. For many, the endless supply symbolized more than just generosity. It revealed the strength of a nation untouched by invasion, a society capable of projecting power across oceans and still finding room to grant comforts to its captives. Each cup carried not just caffeine, but a reminder of America's strength, organization, and determination to maintain normal life even in the middle of a war. As weeks turned into months, the presence of coffee became woven into the very rhythm of daily life inside the camps. The morning meal no longer surprised the prisoners. It grounded them. Attendance, work assignments, and inspections all seemed to revolve around that first hot cup. Guards would wake the buildings at dawn, and within minutes, the sound of tin mugs echoed across the dining hall. The drink was not just a perk. It signaled the start of the day's strict schedule. Beyond breakfast, coffee found its place in other parts of the camp routine. When work groups marched out to local farms, sawmills, or road crews under contract with the U.S. government, their rations often included a thermos filled with hot coffee prepared that morning. Farmers who supervised these work groups noticed with amusement how eagerly the Germans gulped it down during breaks, even in the hot summer weather. The habit of drinking coffee at every break seemed strange to some locals, but for the prisoners it had already become an inseparable part of being held captive. The drink also became tied to camp leisure. Many camps established libraries, theaters, and even internal newspapers created by the prisoners themselves. Editorials in these typed sheets often mentioned coffee, whether in complaints about shortages of sugar or in jokes about Americans using caffeine as a weapon. Camp orchestras and choirs practiced after supper, and men would often gather beforehand with mugs in hand, treating the drink almost like a ticket to social life. In some camps, coffee became a form of trade. A prisoner working in the kitchen might sneak an extra ladle full into a friend's cup in exchange for favors, help with laundry, a handmade chest set, or a drawing. The value placed on those few extra sips revealed just how important the routine had become. Cigarettes and Red Cross packages were prized items, but coffee ranked almost as high, not because it was scarce, but because it carried the comfort of certainty. Medical staff, from both America and Germany, even saw how it changed people's moods and health. Reports showed that prisoners seemed less tired and more willing to help during morning headcounts after they got coffee. For men used to the tiring action of fighting and then the boredom of being locked up, coffee gave them a mental lift. It made them remember they were still people with routines, not just numbers behind a fence. For the guards, giving out coffee was also helpful. It calmed people down, made them less restless in the morning, and gave prisoners a small but good reason to follow the day's schedule. Handing out coffee at sunrise was as much a way to run the camp as it was a friendly thing to do. Without knowing it, both the guards and the prisoners depended on the same routine, which slightly blurred the lines between enemy and friend. By the middle of the war, the coffee line was one of the few things prisoners could rely on when everything else was uncertain. Long after the lights went out and the buildings were quiet, men whispered to each other about the next morning, happy knowing that no matter what happened, the day would start with a familiar hot drink. For many prisoners, the coffee routine became more than just something they did at camp. It became a memory they wrote about later. Letters they sent home, even though checked carefully, often mentioned the drink in a hidden way. Some men wrote about their mornings using phrases like, "We start the day as if at home," or "Our breakfast is pretty good." Even though American checkers often removed specific details about food to avoid causing anger in Germany, the feeling in the letters hinted at how surprised the men were. Families back home waiting in long lines for limited amounts of margarine or watered-down milk would hardly believe their sons drank real coffee every morning in enemy territory. Stories collected after the war show how much this simple habit stuck in their minds. Former prisoners interviewed many years later in Germany still talked very clearly about that first sip each morning. For some, they didn't remember the buildings, the work they did, or even the watchtowers as much, but the smell of coffee in the cool morning air. One former prisoner said that whenever he smelled coffee in later years, he was immediately taken back to a camp in Texas, hearing the noise of metal cups and the sound of boots on wooden floors. Writings also show how prisoners linked coffee with feeling a bit respected. They were still enemy soldiers without weapons or uniforms, but getting the same hot drink as their guards made them feel a little less like enemies. It gave them the sense of being treated like men, not just defeated enemies. These feelings stayed with them and shaped a story that being held by Americans, while restrictive, didn't make them feel less human. Secret camp diaries kept despite the danger back up these stories. In one notebook from a camp in Arkansas, a young soldier drew daily schedules, marking each morning with a small coffee cup. His notes on the side say he looked forward to those few minutes more than anything else all day. Another diary entry compared the drink to a friendly welcome from the New World. Although these writings stayed hidden until after they were freed, they show how important coffee became to them while locked up. Historians looking at these stories have noticed that the memory of coffee often overshadowed the tougher parts of camp life. Prisoners still dealt with boredom, hard work, and constantly being reminded they had lost. But when asked what stood out to them the most, many mentioned the same thing: the daily serving of real coffee. The fact that something so small seemed so important shows how symbolic it was. In Germany after the war, when former prisoners met up, they shared stories about camp life over coffee again, but now freely. Veterans laughed about how they once couldn't believe how nice their captors were. Some even said that the habit of drinking coffee first thing in the morning, which became common in German homes after the war, started in those camps where they had tasted it again. So the drink was more than just something to eat or drink. It became a memory linking their time as prisoners to their lives after the war, connecting the past to the present with every sip. The great amount of supplies that surprised the German prisoners also made them feel uneasy when they started comparing their situation to others. By the middle of the war, news got into the camps through newspapers the Americans allowed, or letters from families saying that their own families in Germany had very limited supplies. Bombing had destroyed storage places and train tracks, and people often waited for hours to get small amounts of bread or turnip soup. The idea that men held captive across the ocean were drinking hot coffee every day, while their wives and kids struggled to find soap or potatoes, made them feel conflicted. Some prisoners struggled with feeling guilty. In letters written carefully to avoid being caught by checkers, some hinted at their discomfort. "We are not forgotten here. In some ways, we are luckier than you at home." These lines, though not clear, meant a lot. Soldiers who had once thought they were fighting for a great country now found themselves being fed and comforted by their enemies, while their families suffered from a failing war economy. The comparisons also included what was happening on the battlefield. News reached the prisoners about the situation for German soldiers still fighting in Europe, where food was running out and supplies were being cut off by constant Allied bombing. Stories of soldiers sharing thin soups in freezing trenches made the morning coffee in America feel unreal. One former prisoner later said that the difference made him question not only German leaders, but also the whole point of the war. How could the government promise victory when its soldiers and people didn't have basic things that even prisoners were getting overseas? American observers knew about these differences, and sometimes even pointed them out in their news. Articles in U.S. newspapers said that German prisoners in America were being treated fairly according to international rules, with good food and humane conditions. These reports were very different from stories of American prisoners in German hands, many of whom lived on watery soup or bread made with sawdust. Families of American prisoners reading about enemy soldiers getting coffee and full meals sometimes felt angry. But the U.S. government said that keeping high standards showed American values and protected their own men overseas. Among the prisoners themselves, this confusing situation led to endless arguments. Some said that America's kindness was a planned move to influence them politically, while others thought it showed real strength, the ability to be kind even in a total war. Younger soldiers, who didn't believe in Nazi ideas as much, often agreed with the second idea. For them, the coffee was not just food, but proof that America's society worked on very different rules from the strict control of the government. Anger sometimes came up within the camps too, especially when Red Cross visitors reminded the prisoners that their treatment was being watched and made public. A few men complained that being taken care of so well while their friends were dying in battle was almost shameful. Others, however, took a practical view. Surviving as a prisoner with dignity was better than dying in a battle that Germany was already losing. So the coffee became a way to see the contradictions of the war. It was at the same time something comforting, something that made them feel guilty, and something that made them realize things. To drink it each morning was to taste both the kindness of the captor and the failures of their own country. That tension stayed in their minds, making the impact of being held captive go far beyond the camp fences. When the war ended and the prisoners were slowly sent home, many brought with them memories that would change how they talked about America for the rest of their lives. Among these memories, the morning coffee stood out as one of the most lasting. What might have seemed like a small thing became for thousands of men a symbol of how differently their captors had treated them compared to the horrible images shown in wartime information. Interviews done in the 1950s and 60s with former prisoners show how often the topic came up again. Men who had become teachers, store owners, or factory workers still remembered the smell of coffee in the mess hall. Some said that the experience softened their feelings toward the United States, making them more open to Western ideas during the Cold War. In towns across West Germany, reunions of former prisoners often had a pot of strong coffee on the table with jokes that America taught us to drink like this. The influence even spread into German shopping habits after the war. With the Marshall Plan sending money into Europe, American coffee brands like Maxwell House and Chase and Sanborn appeared in stores, sometimes advertised with words about freedom and success. Former prisoners were among the first to buy them, drawn by a taste that reminded them of their time as prisoners. For a generation that had gone through hard times, the return of coffee to everyday life had a lot of meaning. It became not just a drink, but a reminder that the hard times were over and that connections to the world had been rebuilt. Experts looking at the impact of being a prisoner note that the U.S. plan of treating them well paid off. Men who had once fought hard for Germany often became unofficial helpers after being freed, telling neighbors and families about their surprising experiences in America. The memory of getting hot coffee every morning went against Nazi images of the United States as a place of chaos and cruelty. Instead, it showed order, plenty, and even a little kindness. This change in how they saw things mattered in the late 1940s and early 50s, when West Germany was joining the Western group of countries. The impact was also personal. Diaries and writings showed that many former prisoners kept the habit of drinking coffee in the morning for the rest of their lives. It gave them not just energy, but a stable routine that had once kept them going while locked up. Some even passed the tradition to their children, linking family breakfast tables in Germany after the war to the mess halls of American camps. The fact that this habit continued shows how being held captive, though hard, left marks that shaped daily lives long after the war was over. In the big picture of history, wars are often remembered for battles, agreements, and political changes. But for the men who lived through being held captive, small things had a lot of meaning. The cup of coffee given without fail meant more than just caffeine. It showed the difference between two societies, how one country treated its enemies, and the unexpected kindness found during a time of global conflict. For German prisoners, it was proof that even in defeat, they could still feel respected. And for many, that memory lasted longer than the sound of guns or the sight of destroyed cities.